Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much to Katie Baker for that video and to the wonderful, brilliant Helena Kennedy for that introduction. I've been in chambers with her for about a decade now, and I'm still intimidated every time I see her. A quick introduction from me. My name's Harriet Johnson. I'm a barrister at Doughty Street Chambers, where I specialise in cases of violence against women and girls. As Helena pointed out, since we all write books, I'm also the author of Enough, the Violence Against Women and How to End It, which was published by HarperCollins in April of this year. Please accept my apologies for not being there in person. I'm away from London with work this week and I couldn't make the logistics work to get back to participate in person. Also, by dialing in, I wanted to give you the impression that I was very, very important. So hopefully that's worked. I wanted to talk to you briefly about the law and about a woman called Nicola Stocker. In 2012, she published on Facebook that her ex-husband had strangled her. Her ex-husband sued her for defamation and won. Not, as you might think, because in fact he hadn't strangled her. The High Court in fact found it was more likely than not that he had, as Nicola had described, put one hand over her mouth and the other around her throat, but he still won his defamation action. The judge in the High Court used an arbitrary legal definition of strangulation that he'd found in a dictionary and decided that strangulation meant an intention to kill. He found that because Stocker's husband's intention had been to silence her, not to kill her, she had in fact defamed him by saying he'd strangled her. She eventually won her case in the Supreme Court, but how many women have the physical, emotional and financial resources to embark on that sort of battle? Bearing in mind that when we're talking about SLAPPS being used to silence victims of sexual harassment, we are often talking about people who've been through trauma already and are now being asked to litigate it. As our colleagues Jen Robinson and Dr. Kaylee Yoshida have asked in their new book on this precise topic, how many more women? We have 4 stunning speakers for this afternoon's session, an incredible array of award-winning journalists, authors and publishers with an awe-inspiring dedication to speaking truth to power, which often comes at significant personal cost. I cannot think of a better qualified panel to help us discuss how we can prevent SLAPPS from silencing reports of sexual harassment. Up first, we have Meirion Jones. He's an award-winning investigative journalist who's currently the editor of the Bureau of Investigative Journalism. He spent many years running investigations at Panorama and Newsnight, where his stories exposing everything from US election fraud to Jimmy Savile to toxic waste dumping in Africa have won him innumerable well-deserved awards. We are delighted to have him here. Meirion will be followed by Gabriel Pogrund, the Whitehall editor at the Sunday Times, who you've just heard a little bit about. He was the one who revealed that the then MP Charlie Elphicke had been accused of sex crimes. Elphicke brought legal action against the Sunday Times, which spent some years, and I would wager not an inconsiderable amount of money, defending it, only for Elphicke to finally drop the suit earlier this year. Gabriel's a specialist investigative journalist who's written a book about Corbyn's Labour Party, worked covering US politics at the Washington Post, and last year he won the Anti-Corruption Journalist of the Year award at the British Journalism Awards for his work on the Greensill scandal. So thank you so much for joining us, Gabriel. After Gabriel, we'll be hearing from Suyin Haynes, who you can see on your screen. Previously a senior reporter at Time magazine, where she was based in both London and Hong Kong, Suyin is now the editor-in-chief at the brilliant Gal Dem. I'm sure you're all already know that Gal Dem is an award-winning publication that focuses on sharing the perspectives of people of colour from marginalised genders. We're really looking forward to hearing Suyin's thoughts on strategic litigation and its role in silencing women. Finally, we're absolutely delighted to be able to welcome Paola Ugaz, the multi-award-winning Peruvian investigative journalist who has dedicated her career to exposing injustice and human rights abuses globally. She has exposed stories of abuse in the Catholic Church, human and drug trafficking, child poverty, racism and human rights abuses all over the world. In 2019, she was named the journalist with the most lawsuits against them in Peru, a dubious award, but one to be worn as a badge of honour, I think. As a result of her work, she receives near constant harassment and abuse online. Nevertheless, she persists. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our speakers for this afternoon. Turning first then to Gabriel, over to you.
How long should I speak for? Do I have about as long as I want? 10 minutes. Okay. It's important to ask. I will go on. Well, no. Hi everybody. It's wonderful to be here today. Speaking alongside such esteemed journalists and in front of so many people whose faces I recognise as partners in the general enterprise of subjecting rich and powerful people to overdue scrutiny. As has been mentioned, I think primarily here because of the work that I did on the former Conservative parliamentarian Charlie Elphicke, and I thought it might be worth just starting off by offering a brief, a few reflections on what exactly it was that happened. So it was in March 2018 that we reported on the fact that Elphicke had both been accused of sexual assault by two former parliamentary aides, and we subsequently revealed that he'd also been accused of rape and that the Metropolitan Police had failed to take action. Now, I was actually asking our chief editorial lawyer at the Sunday Times, Pia Sama, who's in the audience here today, whether what happened kind of definitively constituted SLAPP and what exactly. This is obviously, conferences like these tend to specialise in people that unearth evidence of financial crimes and corruption, and sexual harassment and sex crimes cases are probably fewer and far between in terms of kind of protracted years-long cases of this variety. And I mean, in terms of the basis on which Elphicke ended up suing us for these articles we reported. So we done these two pieces. I think Baroness Kennedy might have mentioned that Elphicke quite quickly got on the front foot, retained the services of Carter Ruck, who argued that in publishing these stories we'd violated his privacy and defamed his character. We were definitely circumscribed in what we could say by kind of the post Cliff Richard landscape and the restrictions in terms of reporting on ongoing police investigations. I guess the word Kafkaesque is probably a bit of a cliche, but I do remember the day after the story was published, tuning onto the Andrew Marr show, and obviously for all Sunday newspapers, having him pour over one story is a mark of benediction, and we did, as it happened, put the story on the front page, so I had expected to see it. And if I recall correctly, and I should at some point review this on iPlayer, but I think he showed the front page of every single national newspaper story, and then kind of conveniently glossed over the Sunday Times, showed something inside the book rather than on the front page. And I mean, that kind of set the tone for the coverage generally. I mean, Carter Ruck naturally, correctly intuited that most papers would not have the underlying basis to justify reproducing this story themselves, and so the story basically just died. It's fun. I'm so pleased about what's happened in the intervening half decade, but we all like talking about stories of ours that had kind of massive consequences. Candidly, the byproduct of our defamation law system was that in the moment I was mortified by the lack of impact that it had, because Elphicke succeeded in getting his lawyers to stop others from reporting on these things. And I know that we've got a thankfully international context over here today, but certainly in Britain we are dependent on the BBC to get stories real traction. And the BBC's dominance is obviously a blessing and a curse. We're lucky to live in a country where there are some solid agreed upon facts. Occasionally on Fleet Street, though, it feels unfortunate, because if the news chiefs down at Broadcasting House deem they don't have the gumption or desire to cover something, that can sort of be it. In the years that followed, Elphick sued us, and he did so, as I mentioned, on the basis that we'd, interfered with his right to privacy and defamed him. And I mean, the shocking reality of this was that we had to argue that we were right to do what we did, and we did that on the basis, in the end, of pleading both public interest. So that's the section 4 defence. Our disclosures served the public interest, but also we did this rather traditional thing for a newspaper, which was we said that what we said was true. We said that it was a fact. He had indeed been accused of sex crimes, and he had indeed been accused of rape, and we didn't say that he had been accused of those things lightly, but we said them because they were facts, and they were facts which mattered. And I mean, one thing I don't think I'd fully reckoned with at the time that we did these stories was, just because something is true, it doesn't mean you can say it. I mean, we've learned the hard way that that is the case. It's funny, kind of the structure of the law has all these invisible effects, and I know that you don't get people demonstrating at Parliament Square pleading for greater press freedom, especially for newspapers. But I often speak to kind of politically disinterested, or at least media law illiterate friends, and ask them if they could name cases involving the Me Too movement in America. To which they say, "Oh yeah, well, Harvey Weinstein." And Jeffrey Epstein, and can't remember the name of the former Alabama governor. Was it Roy Moore? There are people they can kind of identify as having committed severe crimes, and the criminal justice system failed the people that allege those crimes. And then you come to the UK, and conspicuously, there aren't that many people that have actually committed criminal offences. It often lies in this kind of grey zone of harassment and touching or pin. I don't want to kind of enumerate the actual offences in question, but look at the allegations against the now exonerated Connor Burns, or Chris Pincher, who was alleged to have done something at a public event. I mean, people don't notice, but they only find out about the things that journalists can report, because they're neither under police investigation, where all these privacy rights become engaged, and which don't kind of meet the criminal threshold, and are therefore easier to report. So you're much likelier to hear about unpleasant comments, or obviously outrageous behaviour, but not of the you could be sentenced to prison for this. So Elphick was unusual. It was also unusual that there was this parallel police investigation for which he was eventually convicted, and he served time in prison. And I think, I was talking about whether this was a SLAPP-style litigation. I think for me, it certainly was that, when, having been discharged from prison, he continued to sue us for having had the temerity to reveal he was under investigation for crimes, including those for which he was in fact convicted in one instance. So, I mean, that is it. It was insane. I mean, I kind of remember he, been eating prison food for a year, came out and thought, I'm going to resume suing the Sunday Times now, which is shocking. And I got to say, I mean, thanks to Pia, who is the most amazing strategist and lawyer, not to mention person, it was basically fine for me. I mean, I know that these things you hear people talk about how they were hounded and harassed, and I mean, it wasn't particularly fun having to partake in endless, legal conversations. It wasn't a straightforward process, but basically, thanks to the protection the Sunday Times affords, which I know is a privilege, we were okay. But we were indebted to one of our amazing sources as well, and I'm not going to name her, but she was the most remarkable person, and she defended. In order for us to defend ourselves, she had to defend herself. She had to, as Baroness Kennedy remarked upon, prove that we were, in fact, well, we didn't only have to prove that Charlie Elphick had been accused of rape. I mean, she basically had to go back and prove that what she had said was itself true, that the offence she had alleged was based on kind of good faith, reasonableness, that that the offence, the underlying offence, the offence underpinning the allegation actually happened. And I mean, this took place over years. I mean, she had to wait for him to go to prison and then leave, and then years after the fact, agree, which she did before Elphick dropped his claims, to defend us in court. And I mean, most people don't have the fortitude to do that. It's not a case of courage. It's probably a case of being able to move on with one's life and survive and thrive and live a life unencumbered by the anxiety-inducing prospect of ongoing legal action. But yeah, we were the ones having to say that what we said was true, and the burden was on us. Elphick could just say it's false, and cue years-long, extremely expensive litigation, where we were the ones. The onus was on us to prove that what we said was accurate, and that meant kind of reliving the trauma. It meant the victim recounting what happened to her, when it happened, how it happened, who was there, what the evidence was. I mean, it was not just recounting the anyway painful process of having reported these crimes to the Conservative Party Whip's office and then latterly the police. So I did have, I don't know how much I'm going over on time. Is the answer a bit? Okay, I might just, try weave a couple of things into my answers. But yes, I suppose I was going to say that as a reporter, I always feel a little bit, I don't necessarily know that it's for me as a reporter to kind of offer reflections on what should be done now, but I thought it would be helpful to give you some insight on some of the obstacles we faced, and I might give you a few more thoughts when we do Q&As, but I will stop spieling on for now. So thank you very much.
Shall I just cue myself then? So I'm Meirion from the Bureau of Investigative Journalism. Greetings, all you fellow anti-slappers. We're being sued at the moment by Boys Schiller Flexner. He's working on behalf of the Nazarbayev Fund, which was set up by Nursultan Nazarbayev, the ex-dictator of Kazakhstan. You can't call him a kleptocrat because he changed the law in Kazakhstan so that he can't be prosecuted for stealing money from the Kazakh state. So he's not a kleptocrat because he cannot actually be convicted of it. Boys and Co. also acted for Harvey Weinstein. He didn't just act for Harvey Weinstein. He commissioned a bunch of private spooks called Black Cube to spy on the journalists who were working on the story, to spy on the victims, to try to stop the story coming out. So, if he's true to his pattern, there's any Black Cube out there, hi from us. But what then is the sort of connection between sexual harassment and SLAPPS, apart from David Boys and Co., obviously? Some of you will know me from the Netflix documentaries earlier this year, Jimmy Savile, A Very British Horror Story. Now, Jimmy Savile, according to the official figures, had at least 450 victims. There are far more who didn't come forward. There are people who've come forward to me and people like that. There are many, many more, the majority of his victims, who didn't want to have to say anything about it ever again. There are thousands of people who are assaulted, hundreds who are raped. He was protected by three things. One, the bosses of the organisations he worked for, like the BBC. People at a very high level at the BBC knew what was going on. A future controller of Radio 1 confronted him about the fact that he was having underage girls back to his flat overnight. What they were worried about was that it would come out in the papers. They didn't tell him to stop doing it. At the end of the meeting, this person said, "What can you do?" Well, you could have reported him to the police. You could have asked him to stop doing it. You could have sacked him. And those attitudes were common across hospitals, schools, everywhere, where they thought they were getting more out of Savile than whatever he was doing to teenage girls. And they were getting money, they were getting prestige, etc. The second level of protection was his very powerful friends like Prince Charles, whatever happened to him, and who actually got quite cross, I understand, when I wrote a piece earlier this year saying that Savile at one point was Charles's mentor, which came out from the letters that we got making the Netflix film, and obviously Margaret Thatcher. But his third level of defence, and the thing that really comes to it with us, is the law. For decades, journalists tried to get that story out. I know of journalists who tried to get the story out in the 60s. In the 90s, Sunday Mirror tried to. The terror of having to face George Carman QC in court with your vulnerable, victims giving evidence, and he is able to bring Prince Charles, the Prime Minister, the Pope in as character witnesses. Again and again, journalists were terrified and scared off. Or usually the journalists wanted to go with the story, but their editors or their lawyers just said, we cannot do this. It's going to cost us £1 million. He constantly used those threats. And in 2008, I noticed that The Sun had published a picture of him at the notorious children's home, Haute de la Garenne. Obviously, the article said he was in no way connected with abuse, but I knew what they were trying to say. It was only this year that I got hold of the lawyers' letters from Savile's lawyers, which terrified The Sun. And in the end, they said they were revised. If we go ahead with this story, he will sue us. It will cost us £1 million. Are we prepared to do that with this story? And they took the decision not to. And those things, most of these things, we don't even know about because we don't hear about the failed attempts to bring people to justice. But with Savile, my belief is that if we reform our libel law in the way that some of the anti-SLAPP legislation is being suggested, so that people cannot use it as a way of suppressing the truth and protecting wrongdoers, my belief is that at least 100 women would not have been raped. At least 1,000 people would not have been assaulted. And I think, there is no greater indictment of our libel law at the moment, which is designed to protect wrongdoing. I'll leave it there, sorry.
I think we've got Suyin up next.
Can you hear me okay? Yeah, okay, great. Thank you so much to the Foreign Policy Centre and Justice for Journalists Foundation for having me. I'm really happy to be on this panel and for Gal Dem to be included in these conversations. And apologies that I can't be there in person, as I just landed this morning on a flight from Malaysia. And I know my dear friend Claire has just shared some of her own insightful experiences from her work there with the Sarawak report. So it was great to hear that earlier. But I hope that even though I'm virtual, I can still share some insight nonetheless. So obviously at Gal Dem, for people who haven't heard of us, we are a small independent award-winning media organisation dedicated to sharing the perspectives of people of colour from marginalised genders. I'm going to start by sharing a bit of context about us and then a bit about our experience with SLAPPS. So originally we were formed as a group of university friends in 2015. We became a formal company in 2019 and I became editor-in-chief last summer in 2021. Our journalism touches on everything from holding institutional injustice to account, to countering tired stereotypes and mainstream media narratives, to revealing hidden histories, to centering joy in our communities. Through our investigative work, we have driven news agendas and shaped debates, including investigations on transphobia in the gender-based violence sector, the multiple ways in which the Somalian refugee Shukri Abdi was failed by the British states, and most recently in collaboration with Liberty Investigates, in which original reporting revealed a shocking number of asylum seeker deaths in Home Office accommodation over the last 3 years. However, there have been several frustrating limitations to this work, which brings me to the apt title of our session, SLAPPS 2. Most prominently for us, it's the omniscient threat of legal risks which come from holding power to account in our position as a small publisher within the British media landscape and under British libel law. Like many other independent publishers, we don't have an in-house legal team and we operate on tiny constrained budgets, as I know many other speakers have touched upon in this conference. We have no billionaire backing. Instead, we are funded by our membership model and commercial partnerships. Every financial decision we make is really carefully considered and weighed up against the other demands of our business. So choosing to invest resources, time and labour into investigative projects really doesn't come lightly to us. And frankly speaking, a litigation claim could have the potential to financially devastate us. I'm going to speak in vague terms with some discretion about two stories where the threat of SLAPPS came into play for us. And I can't go into too much detail, unfortunately, for obvious reasons. But due to the sort of risk of defamation and libel in particular, earlier this year we were unable to publish two significant stories that our team members have been working on for the last 2 years. And this is after an exhaustive amount of time and energy was spent on them. And although a SLAPP wasn't brought against us in either instance, the risk for both stories was deemed too great for us to try to weather, and ultimately we weren't able to publish either of them. So I guess that's kind of a slightly different experience to maybe what some other people have shared so far. These two stories included a series of sexual harassment and abuse allegations about two separate high-profile individuals, and both were firmly in the public interest. Ultimately, we were unable to bring these stories to publication due to the kind of lack of resources that we had, and the kind of how this might affect any protection that we could offer our journalists, as we usually work with freelancers or any of the subjects in either story. In one instance, one of the stories was published by a larger news organisation that did have the financial and legal power to take it over the line. And in a similar way to the sort of the reflections that you just heard on Jimmy Savile, I know anecdotally of at least a dozen journalists that have tried to get this particular story out over the last 5 years in particular. So although it's great that it's out, I feel like we could have helped contribute to that, and it's unfortunate that we were unable to. In the second instance, that story still hasn't been told, and I think, as was just mentioned, and as many of us here will know, this is really symptomatic. You know, the amount of stories that do run and do see the light of day are just the tip of the iceberg. I kind of want to talk about the impact that this has on individuals involved, particularly when it comes to matters of accountability, redress and denials of justice, as Baroness Kennedy spoke about earlier. Survivors deserve justice, and Gal Dem is in a really unique position given the audiences we serve and the trust that we have built with those we represent. So to not be able to fulfill the storytelling that is faithful and authentic to these experiences is really traumatizing, frustrating and disempowering, first and foremost for survivors, but also these sentiments ring true for us as journalists and publishers too. I think these experiences, both these instances, show how the threat and fear and risk of incurring a SLAPP intended to shut down public interest reporting have stifled and silenced our contributions that could have been made. It's been really harmful for survivors and has meant that we've not been able to do our jobs as journalists in the way that we would like to. But we were really pleased to have been invited by Susan earlier this year to submit a statement detailing our experiences to the consultation, and we're quite heartened by the findings in July. We feel it's really important that not only independent media are included and respected in these discussions, but the most marginalised in British society are too. Gal Dem's journalism has been and will always be provocative and boundary pushing. That's why it's a really hard thing to say, but it's a reality that potential SLAPP lawsuits are a risk that we just can't afford to undertake at the moment. Our core part of our mission will always be to platform people of colour from marginalised genders, and it's our privilege to be entrusted with their stories, particularly as they pertain to serious allegations, whether that's abuse, harassment, whistleblowing and more. But without serious legislative reform and protection for independent media, those voices really do risk being silenced forever. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ian. That was wonderful. Okay, turning to our final speaker, all the way from Peru, I believe, or are you in Spain at the moment, Pao?
I'm in Peru.
Ladies and gentlemen, Paola Ugaz.
Yes. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Okay. Hi, my name is Paola Ugaz. I'm a journalist from Peru in South America, and since 2019, my story is really similar with the story that revealed the Boston Globe about sexual abuse in the Catholic Church, but without all the judicial trials and harassment. And I investigate a Catholic sect called Sodalicio in Peru, and they abuse a lot of his members since 1971. The Sodalicio was founded. I think my story it shows how SLAPP is working in my country. I have been accused of rocambolesque things, such as, for example, of wanting to commercialize uranium and plutonium in the north of Peru with the family of the Peruvian Nobel Prize winner in literature, Mario Vargas Llosa, and sell them outside the country to terrorist groups in the Middle East. I received more than 7 lawsuits, and I have been denounced more than 30 times before the prosecutors for various crimes, and they investigate me since 2021 as a leader of a network of laundry and other crimes. After the publication of the book, Half Mom, Half Soldiers, I received a lot of harassment as a journalist, as a woman, and they always talk about me like an ugly person, a silly person, and they always talk about my body. They says that not even your organs are worth 10,000 soles, like $30,000. And they harass me on social media, they harass my family. And I want to talk about Sodalicio. The Sodalicio is an organization that moves on several fronts at once: religious, economic, and political. It is led by Priest Jaime Bertel Gomez and a bishop of Impura, the north of Peru, Jose Antonio Eguren. The journalist Pedro Salinas and I, who revealed the case, have been persecuted by the prosecutor's office on the basis of false accusation created by the media ecosystem of disinformation financed by the Sodalicio and its business partners, such as the recently elected mayor of Lima, Rafael López Aliaga, a member of Opus Dei, and the Chilean Jose Cueto, one of the owners of the Latam Airlines. The persecution against me and Pedro Salinas and our family is of a judicial nature, but we have also been the target of surveillance, spying of our homes, and we have received death threats saying, "You are going to die, Rojos. The Peruvian Charlie Hebdo is coming. We are going to fumigate you with bullets." It's for this reason that the persecution I suffer as a journalist and a mother of 2 children cause concern at the international level, being followed by Media Defense, George Clooney Foundation, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, and others. My answer to the persecution still stands: more and better journalism. But the serious imbalance caused to my life is palpable. I have to delay the publication of the book I am preparing on the abuse and the finance of the Sodalicio. Currently, the power with the Sodalicio lies with the priest Jaime Bertel. He has been pulling the financial stream of an organization who has offshores and a lot of money in Peru and countries such as Colombia and Chile. During the persecutions, we learn that we have to tell our story abroad the frontiers of Peru, because here the SLAPP, the strategic lawsuit against public participation, doesn't matter for the authorities, doesn't matter for the prosecutor's office, doesn't matter for anybody. They don't just calibrate your work as a journalist. They only open the cases against you, and they don't care about the truth. I don't have the information to say that it's a corruptions network against me. I think now it's like they The sodalicio have a lot of power, and they have a lot of networks in all of the part of the powerful circles in Peru, and that's why I've been persecuted since 2018 until now. That's why I have some good news to share with you. On November 10, I met with Pope Francis at the Vatican, who is meeting for the first time with a journalist who has investigated child abuse within a religious organization. The meeting was very significant for me because it represents a recognition and a boost to my work as a journalist. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Paola. Because I can't be in the room, I think Meirion has very kindly agreed. This seems to be a surprise. Anyway, somebody has kindly agreed to point out questions from the room, and I wonder if you'd be so kind then to speak into the mic so that our remote participants can hear the questions as well.
Sure.
Do you think non-disclosure agreements should be banned totally? I know that in California they're banned when they relate to sexual harassment claims. Is that something that you would all support, or do you think there are rooms to police them better, but they can be useful for the victims as a way to sort of negotiate a settlement and a way to avoid going to tribunal?
I think the non-disclosure agreement to protect the abuser or the institution should be banned. It may be that there are circumstances where the victim does not want the circumstances to be made public, and that should still be possible.
Yeah, I would. Nothing further to add from me. I would agree with that. I think, unfortunately, it's more instances than not, they're often implemented to protect the abuser.
I agree with Meirion.
Paola, do you have any views on banning of non-disclosure agreements?
In my country, we don't. We can have. If you do that, you can be persecuted by the judicial authorities. So I am a favor to do that, to be open. But in Peru and in other countries in South America, we couldn't do that, and it's really bad to work in that circumstances.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. The question has a bit of a legal angle, so I apologize for that, but I'd be interested in your views, which is, in my experience as a lawyer for a number of media companies, very interested in highlighting sexual abuse and harassment by powerful figures, there is often a very, sometimes insurmountable hurdle in getting stories on the record. And many sources, for obvious reasons, wish to remain anonymous. How empowered do you feel in your various countries in reporting on those kinds of stories where you are relying entirely, let's say, on anonymous sources?
So it's definitely an issue we confront all the time. I mean, it's kind of an editorial and a legal issue. Sometimes editors will ask, well, not necessarily for sexual harassment stories alone, but up to and including them, are they willing to go on the record? And I think that conversation becomes particularly pertinent when we, in a kind of clinical and analytical way, not in a kind of moral or judgmental manner, reckon with weaknesses in evidential weaknesses or issues with respect to the story. We may have to say, well, are they willing to put their name to it, which isn't something we would ever expect anybody to do, but it is something that at times we would need somebody to do, especially if we anticipate or indeed have been confronted with I kind of don't want to use these value-laden terms like holes in the story, but that sometimes is the reality of the matter. I mean, another thing I was going to speak about earlier, which I think is possibly relevant here, is the fact that in order for us to in the UK, we have this kind of section for public interest defence. So this is the idea that, not wholly notwithstanding the accuracy of the story, but distinct from the accuracy of the story, were we was it reasonable for us to report what we did? Was it led by our belief that doing so served the public interest? And sometimes, in order for us to say we were reporting the public interest and we didn't meet the legal requirement to have thoroughly investigated the matter, we'll need to show kind of both sides of the story. But by definition, you can rarely do that with Me Too stories, because you cannot go to I can think of more than one Conservative MP about whom we've sadly failed to proceed with stories. But let's talk about the Charlie Elphick context. We could not have said to him before, "Hello, Mr. Elphick. We're seeking to permanently, rightly besmirch your name by saying that you're being investigated for sex crimes. But we have this little issue, which is that I need to get both sides of the story. So can I ask for your response to these particular matters?" I mean, it's actually comical. Well, it's comical, but it's actually something we are kind of checkmated by. Is well, you can't address these issues or questions or weaknesses with the subject of the story. Therefore, you can't satisfy the legal requirements to show that you've thoroughly and fully investigated to the maximum of your capabilities. And in that kind of situation, sometimes we will say, well, frankly, the only thing that can be done now is that person would need to go on the record for us to satisfy ourselves that we'll be fine, legally, or at least kind of from a PR and strategic point of view. There would be, this person would never in a million years pursue a defamation against us. But yeah, I mean, you can't expect people to do that. So it's definitely a big issue that we face.
I think sometimes when you're dealing with institutions, so like say the Catholic Church, which you've investigated in Peru, I did stuff on the Catholic Church here, and the cover-up of child abuse going right the way up to the Archbishop. You find that they've done internal reports which they've covered up. So you can find internal evidence quite often when you're dealing with an institution. The other thing, of course, is that we tend to treat institutions as monoliths. Very often inside that institution will be people who do want the right thing to happen and the right thing to come out. So when I was investigating the Catholic Church, I ended up with a senior bishop helping me with documents, and eventually somebody in the Archbishop's office who was prepared to pass me internal documents. And even if you couldn't actually use them, once you know something, it's much easier to find it out. The other thing I would say is, so for instance, with MPs, you've got things like the Whip's office. If you can find out that they've been various people have reported to the Whip's office over the years, this is incredibly helpful in building up that pattern and finding other people to go to who may now be further distance from it. Something that happened 5 years ago, 10 years ago, and I'm sure you will have done all those things.
Definitely. One thing, by the way, I mean, one reason we continue to be so indebted to Me Too was that it was just this moment where so many allegations sort of intersected with the bureaucracy of the Conservative Party headquarters and Whip's office. I still think it's quite hard to kind of quantify the import of that, but so much of the time we'll deal with stories which start with, well, this was reported to the Tory Party Whip's office, and gosh, I mean, what I would do to kind of, I'm sure what many people would do to have another moment like that where people felt that they could proceed with things and where they felt they were able to be heard. I mean, yeah, it was obviously such a remarkable moment, and an illegally significant one, because now we'll often have paperwork and WhatsApps and email exchanges attesting to the fact that there was once a time where this person, now more than 5 years ago, felt they believe what had happened to them. They said it had happened to them. They went to somebody they didn't know to say this took place. And though sometimes these things kind of fizzled out procedurally, having that as contemporaneous evidence remains really vital.
Suyin, Paola, do you want to come in?
Do you want to first?
Okay.
Yeah, I guess I would just say, like, from our perspective, I think when it comes to anonymity, just bearing in mind and recognizing that for marginalized people, whether that's of race or gender or sexuality or another identity, like having your name attached can carry different risks or dangers or consequences. So I think that's something we're always really conscious of when looking at these stories. And in some cases it's just not possible. But I think if evidence is strong enough and stands up, like I just was thinking about the BBC and the Guardian's Tim Westwood investigation, and they had 7 women, none of whom were named and all of whom were anonymous, but the evidence was extremely strong. So yeah, I think it's an interesting question, but I would agree, and it's kind of both editorial and legal, kind of a hybrid call.
Do we have time for one more question? Okay.
Sure. Just quickly, this is a question for Suyin, if that's all right. It's a hypothetical question, so if you don't feel like answering it, that's fine. But this is a conference that's focused on solutions. And I was just curious about how and to what extent practitioners feel like the media landscape would change with this UK model anti-SLAPP law. And Suyin, you referenced this second story that remains unpublished. Do you think you would feel comfortable publishing it in a world where the model anti-SLAPP law has been passed by Parliament? Or are there other factors that you would have to take into account that would make you still hesitate to do so?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I will try to answer. I will try to answer to the best of my ability. I think for this second story in particular, what comes to mind for me is the impact on the survivor, because actually in this case it was a person who was telling their own story, and we do run a lot of that at Gal Dem. It's so important for us to be a home for personal essays and personal storytelling, but the sort of gravity and the threshold for which we had already gone through with this person of kind of reliving these experiences, asking for so much detailed evidence, was just really, really traumatizing. So I would be hesitant to revisit this particular case with this model, but that's not to say that might not happen for the future. If that makes any sense, I'm not sure.
Thank you so much. I think that's all we've got time for. So can you join me in thanking our brilliant speakers once again for such a fascinating panel? Thank you.